You wouldn't want to be at the Boston Tea Party. Wharf-watered tea you'd rather not drink. Written by Peter Cook. Illustrated by David Antrim. Map of the Freedom Trail. The Freedom Trail is a pedestrian route in central Boston. Marked by a red line, usually a double row of red bricks set into the sidewalk, it leads visitors around a series of historic sites associated with the Revolutionary War. Established in 1951, the 2.4-mile trail was the idea of local journalist William Schofield. This simplified map shows only a few of the 16 monuments included in the trail. A much more detailed map can be found on the website of the Freedom Trail Foundation. Introduction. The year is 1773. Your name is George Robert Twelves Hughes, and you were born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1742. You have grown up in a time of turmoil when American colonists are first beginning to rebel against the unjust rule of the British government. You are at the center of some of the most important historical events in U.S. history. These events will lead to the American Revolution, an 8-year-long struggle against the might of the British Empire. Eventually, you and your fellow Americans will win your freedom, and a new nation will be born, the United States of America. But all this lies in the future. On the night of December 16th, 1773, you are busy blacking your face with coal dust and disguising yourself as a Mohawk Indian. You are about to take part in the strangest tea party of all time. It is a night that will change American history forever. Boston, cradle of independence. In 1773, Boston is one of the most important cities in North America. It has a population of 15,000, and it is a major port for all trade to and from the Old World. Boston is about to become the center of the struggle against British rule. Several of its citizens will become key figures in the coming revolution, including Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere. Like most other Bostonians, you don't care much about politics. You simply want to make a living as a shoemaker. But you resent the British soldiers, known as redcoats, who are stationed in your town. The presence of the soldiers and the burden of British taxes angers you and many of your fellow citizens. The 13 colonies. Boston is the capital of Massachusetts, one of the 13 colonies established by the British settlers on the east coast of North America during the 17th century. The colonies have their own form of local government, but are subject to laws and taxes imposed by the British Parliament. Your early life. One of 9 children, you became an orphan at 14, and you have always been poor. You apprenticed as a shoemaker but earned little money. When you try to join the British Army, you are rejected because you are just 5 feet 1 inch tall. Things are so bad that you've even spent time in a debtor's prison. Arguing with the redcoat. You make a pair of shoes for a British soldier, but he refuses to pay for them. Many Bostonians are mistreated in similar ways by the British. Handy hint. Don't argue with British soldiers stationed in the town. You could be beaten up, or even worse. No taxation without representation. In 1763, Britain and France signed a treaty to end the French and Indian War. This gives the British control of Canada and makes the American colonists secure from attack by the French and their Indian allies. But the war has cost a great deal of money, and the British Parliament votes to tax the colonists to help pay for the cost of defending them. Over the next few years, Parliament passes the Sugar Act in 1764, the Stamp Act in 1765, and the Townshend Acts in 1767 to raise money by taxing various goods. This leads to protests and the soon-to-be familiar cry of no taxation without representation. American colonists are not represented in the British Parliament, and they have no say in any of the laws it passes. Taxing the colonists. The Sugar Act. Many goods imported into the colonies became subject to tax, including sugar, coffee, wine, glass, paint, paper, and tea. The Stamp Act. Direct taxes were imposed on legal documents, newspapers, and other printed materials. Stamp masters were appointed to collect taxes. Hang him. An effigy of a stamp master hangs from Boston's famous Liberty Tree. Burn him. A mob burned down the house of Governor Hutchinson, who supports the taxes. Handy hint: if you want to keep your friends, don't become a stamp master. The Boston Massacre. Boston becomes the center of discontent with British rule, so the British government stations 4,000 troops in the city, about one soldier for every 4 civilians. On the afternoon of March 5, 1770, a group of boys begins throwing snowballs at a sentry guarding the customs house. You are among the crowd that gathers to watch the fun. When the sentry summons help, a squad of 8 soldiers confronts the crowd and opens fire, killing 5 civilians. You are standing next to James Caldwell, one of the victims, and catch the dying man in your arms. The soldiers are eventually put on trial, but only 2 are found guilty. Their hands are branded to show they are guilty of manslaughter, a light punishment that enrages all Bostonians. What led to the massacre? 10 days before the massacre, a crowd surrounded the house of Ebenezer Richardson, who was an informer to British troops. Richardson fired into the crowd, killing an 11-year-old boy. His funeral was attended by over 2,000 Bostonians. 2 days before the massacre, some off-duty British soldiers are beaten up by Bostonians. This angers the British, many of whom want revenge. Boys throw snowballs at a sentry who calls for help. A crowd gathers. As more snowballs are thrown, the soldiers fire at the unarmed civilians. 3 are killed on the spot, and 2 die later from their wounds. Crispus Attucks is one of those killed. He is believed to have been an African American. Some historians view him as the first casualty of the American Revolution. Handy hint: don't make British soldiers angry. They may shoot you. Sons of Liberty. When the American colonists first protest against the new taxes, few consider independence from Britain. They simply want to be treated fairly and to have some control over the laws and taxes imposed on them by a distant government. But the Boston Massacre fuels a growing resentment against British rule. Citizens begin to band together to oppose new taxes. One group in New York calls themselves the Sons of Liberty, and soon another colonies follow their lead and form their own Sons of Liberty groups. You attend meetings held under the famous Liberty Tree, but at that point you have no idea where the cries of liberty will lead. Means of communication. Handbills. Printed handbills are an important part of the anti-British propaganda campaign run by the Sons of Liberty. Couriers. Committees of correspondence are set up to send messages between the American colonies. These messengers are carried by couriers on horseback. Samuel Adams is a Boston lawyer and leader of the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts. Adams is a firm believer in colonists' rights. Tarred and feathered. The Sons organize the boycotts of merchants who import British goods. They also harass customs officials, some of whom are tarred and feathered by angry colonists. Handy hint: don't get caught giving out handbills, or you might be sent to prison. The tea tax. After the Boston Massacre, the British try to appease the colonists. Troops are withdrawn from Boston, and all major import taxes are removed, except for the tax on tea. The colonists begin to buy British goods again, but not tea. The 1773 Tea Act removes the tax, but sales are controlled by tea agents. This leads to cheaper tea, but the colonists still oppose the new law. You aren't a tea drinker, but you join the crowds at the Liberty Tree on November 3rd to demand that the tea agents resign. Fearing for their lives, the agents ask Governor Hutchinson to take over. By the end of the month, the British tea ship Dartmouth sails into Boston Harbor. The British East India Company. Tea plantations. Tea imported into America comes from plantations in India owned by the British East India Company. The British government wants its company to have control of all tea sold in America. Tea agents. American merchants are worried that if the British can appoint tea agents, they can do the same for other goods. This would mean that they could control trade and even ruin American businesses. Tea drinking. Although all classes drink tea, it is a ritual in middle and upper class homes where ladies serve tea in fine cups made of china or porcelain. Handy hint: get used to drinking coffee. Tea is going to be in short supply. A growing rebellion. With the arrival of the first tea ship, over 5,000 people gather at the Old South Meeting House to hear the leaders of the Sun speak. It is agreed that the tea must not be landed, and the ship should return to Britain. You are in the crowd and watch as 2 more tea ships dock in the harbor. The tea remains on board, but Governor Hutchinson has set a date of December 17th for the cargo to be unloaded under the protection of British soldiers. On the 16th, a huge crowd gathers, determined to stop the tea from landing on American soil. How events unfold. The Dartmouth arrives in Boston Harbor on November 27th, but the crowd prevents its cargo of tea from being unloaded. She is joined by 2 other British tea ships, the Eleanor and the Beaver. Governor Hutchinson is determined that the tea will land. He knows if a ship isn't unloaded within 20 days of entering port, its cargo can be seized. The governor plans to avoid this law enforced by British soldiers. Francis Roth, son of the Dartmouth's owner, rides to Hutchinson's house outside Boston to seek permission for the ship's return to Britain with its cargo of tea. The governor refuses. Inside the meeting, some are dressed as Indians, ready for the action about to take place that night. Roth arrives to tell them the governor's position. The tea party is about to begin. Old South Meeting House. Built in 1729 as a Puritan meeting house, it is the largest meeting space in colonial Boston. Important meetings of the Sons of Liberty take place here on November 30th and December 16, 1773. When he hears about Governor Hutchinson's refusal to let the tea ships return to Britain, Samuel Adams tells the crowd the meeting can do nothing more to save the country. Handy hint: wear a disguise to avoid being spotted at the tea party. The Boston Tea Party. The Sons decide that the tea must be destroyed. Around 30 men are set this task. They dressed as Mohawk Indians to avoid being recognized. About 100 more, including you, join them. Your job is to board a ship and demand the keys for its hold. The captains hand over the keys, and the Indians lift the tea chests onto the deck. They split open 342 tea chests on 3 boats with hatchets and tip the contents into the sea. It takes 3 hours to complete. A huge crowd cheers you on from the dockside. Tea Party Song. Rally Mohawks, bring your axes, and tell King George we'll pay no taxes on his foreign tea. Tea Thief. You spot Captain O'Connor trying to steal tea, which the Sons have forbidden. His coat tears as you grab him, but he escapes and is chased by the crowd. The piece of torn coat is nailed to a whipping post to shame O'Connor. Handy hint: don't steal any British tea. The crowd might lynch you. Punishment from London. The Intolerable Acts. When news of the Tea Party reaches Britain, the King and Parliament are outraged. A series of laws, known as the Intolerable Acts, are passed to punish the colonists. Boston Harbor is closed, the powers of the Massachusetts government are reduced, and the colonists are ordered to provide housing for British troops. The people of Boston are angered by this latest outrage from London and know they must take a stand to defend their liberty. But many loyalists still support the British, and you are about to encounter one of them. A loyalist encounter. You stop John Malcolm, a known loyalist and customs informer, from beating a boy. He strikes your head with his cane, knocking you unconscious. Led by the Sons of Liberty, a crowd drags Malcolm from his house and takes him to the Liberty Tree, where he is tarred and feathered. Revenge. Angry members of Parliament pass the Boston Port Act, closing the harbor until the tea is paid for. Mad King George. King George III is the British monarch during and after the events leading up to the American Revolution. He supports the strong measures against the colonists, stating that we must master them or leave them to themselves. In later life, he suffers from periods of poor health and insanity, believed to be caused by an illness called porphyria. Handy hint: don't get into a fight with loyalists. You could get hurt. The British are coming. It is hoped that the Intolerable Acts will end rebellion in the colonies, but they have the opposite effect. In September 1774, the First Continental Congress is attended by representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies. They protest about the new laws and urge the colonists to arm themselves to defend their rights. General Gage, now governor of Massachusetts, enforces the new laws and is determined to capture your leaders. Hundreds of British troops search the town for weapons and smuggled goods. Paul Revere warns Samuel Adams and John Hancock of the British plan to arrest them. They escape, but local militia decide to oppose the British troops and fight for liberty. Paul Revere. A Boston silversmith and engraver, Revere is a leader of the Sons who took part in the Boston Tea Party. He is also a courier for the Massachusetts Committee of Correspondence. Revere's Ride. On the night of April 18th and 19th, 1775, Revere rides 16 miles from Charleston to Lexington to warn other leaders about the Sons of Liberty and that the British are marching to arrest them. Battles of Lexington and Concord. On April 19th, 75 colonial militia confront 700 British troops on Lexington Green. Shooting begins. 8 militia are killed and 10 wounded. The British then march to Concord to destroy arms supplies. But word spreads, and thousands of colonists begin to converge on the town. Now outnumbered, the British make a fighting retreat back to Boston. Handy hint. Keep your musket handy. The British are on the march. Boston besieged. The Battle of Bunker Hill. The British retreat from Concord inspires other patriots to converge on Boston from towns throughout Massachusetts and the surrounding colonies. By June 1775, American General Artemas Ward leads 15,000 volunteers, who lay siege to 6,400 British troops in Boston. On June 16th, the Americans take up a position on the heights of Charleston Peninsula, controlling access to Boston Harbor. General Gage sends in 2,400 British troops to force them out, and by the next day, a pitched battle takes place. The Americans are driven from the peninsula, but the British lose over 1,000 men, compared to 450 American casualties. The British troops in Boston are evacuated in 1776. The Minutemen are a local militia organized to oppose the British. They are known as Minutemen because they could be called to arms at a minute's notice. You want to join them, but the British stop all able-bodied men from leaving Boston to join the Patriots. The Battle of Bunker Hill. British forces land and advance on Breed's Hill. 2 attacks are repulsed, but a third drives the Americans back along the peninsula. You watch the battle from across the bay. The Redcoats are called so because of their color of their uniform. Many of the British troops are actually German. King George III has German ancestry, and up to 30,000 Hessians from the German region of Hesse are fighting for the British. Handy hint. Throw away any red clothes in case you're mistaken for a redcoat. The American Revolution. The Battle of Bunker Hill is the first major engagement in what will become an 8-year-long struggle for American independence. General George Washington is appointed commander of the Continental Army, who fights the British in the northern colonies. The British dominate the opening years of the war by capturing New York and Philadelphia. But the Americans are now determined to win their liberty, and on July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence is approved by the Continental Congress. The United States of America is born, but the war continues. The United States of America. You escape from Boston in 1775 and meet George Washington, who is planning to recapture the city. You volunteer to fight and spend many months at sea, as well as serving as a private in the militia. Battles at sea. Sailing from Boston, you fight aboard a privateer, a privately owned ship employed to fight the British. Boston is the center of the American Navy, and during the war, captured ships are sailed into the town's harbor. Liberty Bell. The symbol of American independence, the Liberty Bell, rings out after the Declaration of Independence is signed in Philadelphia. Declaration of Independence. Drafted by Thomas Jefferson, this document outlines the principles of independence and includes the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Crossing the Delaware. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington and 2,500 soldiers cross the icy Delaware River. They surprise the British and win battles at Trenton and Princeton. These important early victories boost American morale. Stars and Stripes. The 13 stars and stripes on this American flag represent the 13 original colonies. Handy hint. Join the Navy. It's less dangerous than being a soldier, and you may win a share of the plunder. A new nation. In 1778, the French joined the American side in the war, tipping the balance in favor of the new nation. Clashes continue in the former colonies, but the British lose a critical battle at Yorktown in 1781, where General Cornwallis is forced to surrender 8,000 troops to Washington's army. The war drags on for 2 more years before the British government finally accepts that they cannot win. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris ends the conflict, and Britain formally recognizes the independence of the United States of America. George Washington. As Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, Washington defeats the superior British forces. A grateful Congress elects him as the first President of the United States in 1789. Campaign map. The map above shows the main sites of conflict during the war and indicates the successes of both sides. In 1780, General Cornwallis marched through the Carolinas into Virginia, but is forced to surrender at Yorktown the following year, effectively ending the war. When the war ends, you do not return to Boston, as the British have burned down your shop. You and your wife move to a nearby town, where you will have 16 children. But the part you played on the night of December 16, 1773 will not be forgotten. You live to the great age of 98 and become famous as one of the last living survivors of the Boston Tea Party. Independence Day. You become a popular figure at Independence Day celebrations held on the 4th of July. A centenarian. Your portrait now hangs in the library of the Bostonian Society. It is wrongly called a centenarian because it was believed at the time you were over 100 years. Handy hint, don't forget to celebrate Independence Day each year on July 4th.